The October air in La Crosse carried the dry smell of fallen leaves along the quiet streets. On the evening of October 24th, 1953, Evelyn Hartley was babysitting in a house that should have stayed ordinary. A lamp was on, a child was safe, and the small routines of the night were still in place. But one expected phone call did not come, and her father began doing what worried parents do. He called again, waited, and then drove through the dark toward the Rasmussen home. From there, the case became a careful gathering of details, each one handled because it might matter. A window, a room, a neighbor's memory, a trace found outside, all entered the file slowly. Years later, detectives would return to those same pages, looking for something time had not erased. Tonight, we begin there, with the first quiet facts of a case that never fully left La Crosse. Evelyn Grace Hartley was 15 years old, a student, a daughter, and the kind of young person adults trusted with small responsibilities. She had gone that evening to the home of Professor Viggo Rasmussen and his wife, on Cass Street in La Crosse, to care for their little child while they were away. The arrangement was simple, and that simplicity is part of what makes the first hour so important. Evelyn was expected to telephone her father, Richard Hartley, during the evening, a small family habit meant to confirm that everything was fine. When the call did not come, it did not immediately mean disaster. It meant a parent noticed a missing routine. Richard called the Rasmussen house, and when no one answered, he waited a little, then called again. The telephone rang into rooms where a babysitter should have been able to hear it. That was the first concrete shift in the night. A quiet house was no longer only quiet, it was unresponsive. Richard Hartley then reached the point every parent knows in the body before the mind has words for it. He had to choose whether to keep waiting at home or get in the car and go see for himself. He chose to go. The drive through La Crosse was not long, but in a case file, even a short drive can become a line that separates before from after. At the Rasmussen home, Richard found signs that did not fit neatly together. The house was lit. The baby was safe. The ordinary objects of a babysitting night were still there, but Evelyn was not. He tried to make sense of what he was seeing by moving from one small fact to the next. A door, a window, the stillness of the rooms, the absence of the girl who should have answered the phone. He reportedly entered the house and found enough disturbance to know that this was not a simple misunderstanding. The child in the home had not been harmed, which mattered deeply, and it also made the scene more puzzling. If Evelyn had stepped out by choice, why had she left the child unattended? If she had gone to seek help, why had she not reached a neighbor? If someone had come to the house, how had they entered, and how had they left? These were not dramatic questions then, they were practical ones. The kind police ask because each answer creates the next action. Richard Hartley contacted authorities, and the local police were drawn into what, only a short time earlier, had been a family concern. Officers arriving at a home like that in 1953 had to work with the tools of their time. They had eyes, notebooks, flashlights, measurements, interviews, and the patient habit of looking again. They did not have the kind of modern testing that later generations would take for granted. They could preserve a scene if they understood quickly enough what needed preserving. They could compare stories. They could follow footprints, search yards, and ask neighbors what they had heard. But the first hours were fragile. People moved because they were frightened. Family members arrived because they cared. Neighbors stepped outside because lights and police cars changed the feeling of the street, and every movement, even a well-meaning one, could make the original scene harder to read. The Rasmussen house itself became the first witness. Investigators looked at the rooms where Evelyn had been expected to sit, listen for the baby, and pass an ordinary evening. They noted what was open and what was closed. They considered whether a door had been used or whether a window told a different story. Reports from the period describe a disturbed or broken window, often discussed as one of the central early details. That window mattered because it suggested the house may not have simply been left in a normal way. It made the structure part of the timeline. Someone may have entered there, someone may have left there, or someone may have tried to create that impression. In a quiet investigation, you learn not to force one meaning too early. A broken window is a fact. The story attached to it has to be earned. Officers also had to account for the child in the house. who remained safe and too young to tell them anything useful. That fact brought a strange stillness to the case. There had been no broad disturbance through the whole home, no clear explanation written plainly in the rooms. Instead, there were pieces: a babysitter missing, a child unharmed, a telephone unanswered, a house with signs that did not belong to an ordinary evening. By then, neighbors near Crosse Street were beginning to understand that something serious had happened. Doors opened, porch lights came on, people looked down the block, trying to remember the past hour as if memory were a shelf they could search. The police needed them to remember calmly: had anyone heard a cry? Had anyone seen a stranger? Had any car slowed, stopped, or turned in a way that now seemed unusual? In the moment, most evening sounds are not saved. A car door closes, and the mind lets it go. Footsteps pass on a sidewalk, and they become part of the background. Only later does a witness try to bring them back. That is one reason old cases are so difficult. The details that matter are often ordinary before anyone knows they matter. In the first canvas, officers were not looking for a complete story. They were looking for edges. At times someone looked at a clock, a sound heard between one call and another, a glimpse of movement near the house, a vehicle remembered by color, shape, or direction. Each small account could narrow the unknown space. Even if it did not solve it, cause and effect began to build slowly. Because Evelyn had not called, her father drove over. Because he found the scene troubling, police were summoned. Because police saw signs that she had not simply wandered away, they widened the search. Because the search widened, the neighborhood itself became part of the file. That is how a cold case begins before anyone calls it cold. It begins as a series of necessary decisions made under imperfect light. The first search around the property was careful, but it was also urgent. Officers and those helping them had to look close to the house before rain, wind, darkness, or footsteps changed what could be seen. The yard, the porch, the areas below windows, and nearby paths were examined for signs of passage. Investigators searched for items that might belong to Evelyn because personal objects can tell a quieter story than witnesses can. A shoe, a pair of glasses, school materials, a piece of clothing, or anything misplaced could show direction, struggle, or accident without needing to explain it all at once. Contemporary accounts reported that items connected to Evelyn were found in and around the area, including her glasses and other personal traces. Those finds did not bring certainty. They widened the circle. If Evelyn's belongings were no longer with her, then the question became where they had separated from her, and why. The search moved beyond the living room and the immediate porch. It moved into yards, alleys, and the spaces between houses. In a city neighborhood, those spaces are small, but they multiply quickly. A fence line, a driveway, a hedge, a garage, a narrow strip of grass where leaves can cover what matters. You can imagine an officer with a flashlight moving slowly over the ground, not wanting to miss something because he walked too fast. You can imagine a neighbor standing in a robe near the door, speaking softly, trying to help. You can imagine Richard Hartley waiting for each new word, each new glance, hoping someone would say there had been a mistake. But the facts did not turn back. They kept moving outward. The family routine had become a missing person investigation, and the house had become the center of a search. The early questions were practical. How long had Evelyn been alone in the house before something happened? When was the last confirmed contact with her? At what time did her father first call and receive no answer? How quickly did he arrive? Who else knew she would be babysitting there? Had the Rasmussens told anyone their plans for the evening? Had anyone noticed the family leaving or seen the house after they were gone? Each answer mattered because the timeline was narrow. The narrower a timeline is, the more valuable every verified minute becomes. But a narrow timeline can also make a case harder because there may be too little room for witnesses to have noticed anything clearly. Officers had to build that timeline from fragments. They had to treat each statement with care. A witness might be honest and still mistaken. A neighbor might remember the sound correctly, but not the time. A person might have seen a car, but not the driver. Darkness changes color. Fear changes memory. The mind fills gaps without meaning to. This is why patient detective work often sounds repetitive. Investigators ask the same thing twice, then a third time. Not because they doubt everyone, but because the shape of memory can change as it settles. By late evening, the matter had moved beyond the Rasmussen home. Crosse police had to consider the possibility that Evelyn had been taken away from the immediate area. That possibility changed the scale of everything. A local search could still focus on the neighborhood, but roads now mattered too. So did bridges, outskirts, vacant lots, and places where a vehicle might stop unnoticed. The city sat along the Mississippi River, with bluffs and wooded areas not far from ordinary streets. Crosse had busy public places and quiet residential corners. In other words, it had many places where a clue could be overlooked, not because people did not care, but because the world is full of hiding places when the hour is late. As word spread, the response grew. More officers became involved. Family, friends, students, and residents wanted to help. People who had never met Evelyn learned her name and began looking at their own streets differently. A missing child changes the way a community sees familiar ground. A ditch becomes something to check. An alley becomes something to remember. A parked car becomes a detail worth reporting. And all of this concern, while deeply human, created another burden for investigators. More eyes can find more clues. More voices can also bring more uncertainty. The police had to receive tips, record them, judge them, and decide what needed immediate action. A call about a strange car could matter. A call based on rumor could consume hours. A reported sighting could open a route. A mistaken sighting could pull searchers away from somewhere important. None of this is simple when a young person is missing and the night is still unfolding. The first night carried a kind of quiet pressure that no file can fully preserve. Not drama, pressure. The pressure of knowing that early hours matter while also knowing that hurried assumptions can damage the truth. Officers needed to move quickly, but not wildly. They needed to listen but not accept every story as fact. They needed to search broadly, but still protect the small pieces near the beginning. That balance is difficult even now. In 1953, it was harder. Forensics existed, of course, but not in the way later viewers might imagine. There was no instant database to compare a trace from one place to another. There was no digital map that could hold every call, every movement, and every witness statement in one searchable field. There were paper notes, there were typed reports, there were photographs, measurements, and physical items placed into storage. There were detectives carrying details in their heads because the case was alive in front of them. If they wanted to compare accounts, they read them. If they wanted to revisit a time, they turned pages. If they wanted to know whether a lead had already been checked, someone had to remember or find the notation. That is part of why the Evelyn Hartley case became so dependent on careful record keeping. The first investigators were not only searching for Evelyn, they were creating the record that future investigators would inherit. Every word they wrote had the chance to matter later. Every missed detail could become a permanent silence. The Rasmussens' home, by then, had changed from a private residence into a documented scene. Officers looked again at the possible entry point. They considered the windows and doors. They noted the position of objects inside. They looked for signs that Evelyn had attempted to call, leave, or defend the child in her care. We do not need to imagine beyond the evidence. It is enough to say the scene suggested interruption. Something had stopped the evening from continuing. That interruption left the investigators with two duties at once. They had to search for Evelyn as a living missing person, and they had to preserve anything that might later explain her disappearance. Those two duties can pull against each other. A search wants movement. Evidence preservation wants stillness. A frightened community wants action. A careful file wants patience. Somewhere between those needs, the investigation took its first shape. The neighborhood canvass continued because the case still depended on the outside world. A house can tell only part of the story. The street may tell another part. Officers asked about cars because vehicles can change the range of a disappearance in minutes. They asked about voices because voices sometimes carry farther at night than people expect. They asked about dogs barking, doors closing, engines idling, and strangers walking near the block. Many of these questions may have seemed small to the people answering them, but in an old case, the smallness is the point. A dog barking at the right time might place a movement near a yard. A car engine might suggest a waiting vehicle. An unfamiliar shadow near a garage might give officers one more place to look. So the first night became a patient exercise in placing things, placing sounds, placing people, placing cars, placing the last certain moments of Evelyn Hartley's evening beside the first uncertain ones. Investigators had to treat the Rasmussen home as one point on a map, not the whole map itself. The house explained that something had gone wrong. The neighborhood might explain where the story went next. You can picture the officers beginning close to the doorway, then widening in careful circles. First the porch, then the yard, then the walks along Cass Street, then the nearby streets, alleys, and vacant spaces where darkness could hold a small object. The searchers were looking for anything that seemed out of place, but they were also looking for absences. A missing coat could matter. A missing shoe could matter. A schoolbook left behind could matter, because it suggested Evelyn had not planned to leave. The ordinary items of a 15-year-old girl became part of a record no one wanted to make. That is one of the quiet burdens of a missing person case. A person's life is suddenly studied through the things they did not take with them. A notebook on a table, a pair of glasses no longer worn, a sign of hurry where there should have been routine. Each object asks a small question, and the questions gather. Officers found, or were told of, personal traces associated with Evelyn in and near the house. Newspapers and later accounts would describe her glasses damaged and separated from her. They would describe a shoe and other items that suggested a path away from the Rasmussen home. The details varied in later retellings, as old reports often do. But the central meaning stayed the same. Evelyn had not simply finished babysitting and walked home. Something had interrupted her evening, and that interruption had left marks. A disturbed window can become a sentence in a case file, even when it does not speak clearly. It can suggest entry, it can suggest exit, it can suggest that someone wanted investigators to believe one of those things. In 1953, officers could look for fingerprints, fibers, footprints, and visible marks. They could photograph and measure. They could compare a shoe impression to a shoe. They could preserve glass, clothing, and other physical items. But they could not ask the evidence, the kinds of questions later science would make possible. They could not build a profile from a few hidden cells. They could not search a national genetic database. They could not quickly compare one trace to thousands of records across the country. So they had to stay close to what could be seen. The window, the sill, the floor beneath it, the ground outside. The places where a person might have stepped while leaving in haste. If you were standing there with the officers, you might notice how much depends on light. A flashlight changes what the ground reveals. A porch bulb makes one patch of grass visible and leaves another in shadow. A leaf can hide a print. A footprint can be softened by damp soil. A mark on the house can look different at night than it does in morning. That is why the first search never really ends at night. It continues again after sunrise. The same yard is not the same yard when daylight returns. The officers knew this. The family knew it in a different way. The neighbors understood it as they watched police come and go. Morning would give them more visibility, but it would also mean more time had passed. In a missing person case, time is always doing two things at once. It gives searchers another chance to organize. It also moves the missing person farther from the last known moment, that is, the slow ache inside the record. The first hours also required a basic question that was difficult to answer. Who knew Evelyn would be there? The Rasmussens knew, of course. Her parents knew. Friends or classmates might have known if she had mentioned it. Anyone watching the house might have learned that the adults had left for the evening. But the investigators could not assume a plan where chance might explain things. A person could have approached the house without knowing who was inside. A person could have seen a young babysitter through a window. A person could have been familiar with the neighborhood without being familiar to the family. Or the explanation could have come from someone much closer to the ordinary routines of Crosse. The police had to hold all of those possibilities without gripping any one of them too tightly. That is a hard discipline. People want one shape. They want the story to become simple. But early investigations rarely give that gift. Instead, they give partial facts. A home, a window, a father's unanswered calls, a young girl missing from the place where she was expected to be. Those facts were enough to start a major search. They were not enough to finish one. By the next day, Crosse had begun to move around Evelyn's name. The city was not enormous, and news traveled quickly through families, churches, schools, and businesses. People opened their Sunday papers or heard from neighbors. They learned that a 15-year-old girl had vanished while babysitting. They learned that her father had gone to check on her. They learned that police were searching, and many of them wanted to do something useful. Volunteers began to join the effort. Students helped. Residents searched yards and roadsides. Law enforcement looked beyond the immediate block. The case was no longer contained by the walls of one house. It now belonged, unwillingly, to the whole community. In that wider search, the geography of Crosse mattered. The city rested near the Mississippi River, with the Black River and the Crosse River also shaping the area. There were bridges, rail lines, wooded patches, bluffs, and open spaces beyond the streets. There were places a car could travel quickly. There were places a person on foot might not be noticed. There were university buildings, residential blocks, and roads leading out towards smaller communities. A search plan had to account for all of that. Not because every place was likely, because no place could be dismissed too early. Searchers moved through areas where a clue might have been left. They looked near roads. They checked fields and wooded ground. They examined alleys and vacant lots. They asked property owners to look in garages, sheds, and outbuildings. It was the kind of work that is both urgent and slow. Step, look, call out, wait, move again. You can imagine a line of volunteers walking across uneven ground. Not rushing, not talking much, each person watching the patch ahead. Each person hoping not to find anything and also knowing they are there to find something. That contradiction is part of the emotional weight of a search. People want answers. They also fear what answers might bring. For the Hartley family, every search party meant care. It also meant that the whole city was now sharing their worry. Richard Hartley's private concern had become a public effort. The shift happened quickly. A few hours earlier, he had been a father waiting for a telephone call. Now his daughter's name was being repeated by strangers. The police needed the public's help, but public help came with a cost. More people meant more eyes on the ground. It also meant more footprints near possible evidence, more voices repeating uncertain details, more rumors traveling faster than official information. Investigators had to decide what to release, what to hold back, and how to ask for help without feeding speculation. This was especially difficult in 1953. A case could spread through newspapers, radio, and conversation, but police could not instantly correct every mistaken version. If a rumor moved through town, it might take on a life of its own. Someone might hear that a certain kind of car had been seen, then another person might remember seeing a similar car, because the mind had been prepared to notice it. This does not mean witnesses were careless. It means memory is human. It is shaped by fear, sympathy, repetition, and time. Detectives knew they had to listen carefully. They also knew they had to verify. Reports of possible vehicles became part of the early investigation. A car near a missing person scene can feel important because it offers movement. It explains distance. It explains how someone could leave one neighborhood and enter another without being seen clearly. But a vehicle report is rarely simple. What color was it? Was the streetlight strong enough to see? Was it parked or moving? Was it unusual for that block? Did the witness see the driver or only the shape of the car? Was the sound of the engine connected to the same time as Evelyn's disappearance, or only remembered later? Each question matters, and each answer has to be placed beside the timeline. If the time is wrong, the car may be irrelevant. If the location is wrong, the report may mislead. If the description is too broad, it may apply to hundreds of vehicles. Still, officers had to check, because one true vehicle report could change the whole direction of the case. The same was true of possible sightings. People sometimes believed they had seen Evelyn after the time she disappeared. Others believed they had seen someone walking, or being driven, or standing near a road. Each report required attention. Investigators could not dismiss a sincere caller because the story sounded uncertain. They also could not accept it without support. They had to ask for clothing descriptions. They had to ask for time. They had to ask which side of the street, which direction, which other people were nearby. They had to compare these accounts to what Evelyn was believed to have been wearing. They had to decide whether the witness had actually seen Evelyn or another young person. Darkness, distance, and anxiety can make one figure resemble another. This is not failure. It is the condition under which many witnesses remember. The file grows because people try to help. The file becomes harder to read for the same reason. In the early days, the physical evidence remained central. Investigators looked for a route outward from the house. They considered where items were found and what those locations suggested. If a personal item was near the home, that pointed to the first moments after the interruption. If another item appeared farther away, that might suggest movement. But even a line of objects can be uncertain. An item can be dropped by accident. It can be placed. It can be moved by someone who finds it before realizing its importance. It can be overlooked at first, then noticed later. Each possibility changes the meaning. So detectives had to be careful with the word path. A path is not just a line between objects, it is a conclusion built from reliable connections. And in the Hartley case, reliable connections were difficult to secure. The house gave them a beginning, the belongings gave them fragments, the neighborhood gave them voices. But the person at the center was still missing. That absence made every detail feel larger than it might have felt in another case. A scuff mark could matter. A tire track could matter. A loose statement made in passing could matter. The difficulty was not that there were no leads. The difficulty was that leads arrived faster than certainty. Police in Crosse began coordinating with other agencies. County authorities became involved. State resources were consulted. The search for Evelyn could not remain only a city matter, because the possible area had grown. If a car had been used, the distance from Cass Street could be many miles by morning. Roads leading out of Crosse had to be considered. Nearby towns had to be alerted. Officers elsewhere needed a description and instructions. If they saw anything unusual, they were to report it. If someone matching Evelyn's description appeared, they were to act quickly but carefully. This kind of coordination looks simple when written in a summary. In practice, it is many telephone calls, notes, briefings, and repeated descriptions. It is one officer reading a report aloud to another. It is a dispatcher writing down a license plate that may or may not be correct. It is a patrolman on a rural road watching every passing car a little more closely. It is the beginning of a case becoming larger than its first investigators. At the Rasmussen house, officers continued to return to the beginning. They had to. Every larger theory depended on what had happened there. Had Evelyn been surprised by someone at the door? Had someone entered through a window? Had she tried to reach the phone? Had the child's safety shaped her choices? Had the house been watched before the evening began? These questions could not be answered by instinct. They had to be measured against the room, the marks, and the timeline. That is why a crime scene is not only a place. It is a series of choices made by investigators about what to preserve. Photographs hold the scene after the people have left. Measurements hold distances after furniture is moved. Evidence tags hold objects after memory begins to blur. Statements hold witness impressions before later retellings change them. All of that began in those first days. All of it would matter later when new detectives opened the file and tried to stand, in imagination, inside that same house. The Rasmussens themselves were part of the early timeline, but not in a suspicious way by the known record. They had left their child in Evelyn's care. They returned to a home that had become the center of a police investigation. They, too, had to remember the ordinary parts of the evening. When had they arranged for Evelyn to babysit? When had they left? Who had known they would be gone? Was anything unusual before they went out? Had the child been unsettled? Had anyone called the house earlier? Had anyone come by? The answers helped police define the boundary of normal life before the disappearance. That boundary mattered. Investigators needed to know when ordinary ended. Only then could they study what came after. Evelyn's father also became a crucial witness to the first discovery. Richard Hartley had seen the house before many others arrived. He had made the unanswered calls. He had driven there. He had entered and noticed the troubling signs. His account helped establish the first known condition of the home after Evelyn vanished. This was a heavy position for a parent. He was not only grieving and frightened, he was also part of the evidence record. Detectives had to ask him careful questions during one of the worst nights of his life. What time did he call? How many times? What did he see first? Which door did he use? What lights were on? What did he touch? Where did he go inside? These questions might sound cold from a distance, but they are necessary. They are how investigators keep confusion from becoming permanent. They are also a way of honoring the missing person, because accuracy is a form of care. As the search expanded, newspapers began to carry the story. The press gave the public Evelyn's name and description. It helped spread requests for information. It kept attention on the case, but press attention also created pressure. A newspaper has space to fill each day. A police investigation cannot always produce a new fact each day. That mismatch can create strain. Reporters ask for updates. Families hope public attention will bring a lead. Investigators worry about revealing details only the responsible person might know. The community wants reassurance. The case does not always provide it. In the Hartley investigation, as in many old cases, public attention became both tool and burden. It brought searches, it brought tips, it also brought noise. Reward offers followed, as they often do when a community wants to turn concern into action. A reward can encourage someone to speak. It can reach a person who is afraid, or unsure, or reluctant to become involved. It can make a quiet memory feel worth reporting, but rewards can also bring false claims. Someone may exaggerate, someone may invent, someone may repeat a rumor as if it were knowledge. Investigators must treat reward-driven information with the same care as any other lead. They must ask whether the person could know what they claim to know. They must ask whether the account fits the timeline. They must ask whether it leads to evidence, or only to more words. The reward is not an answer. It is another doorway into the file. In the days after Evelyn disappeared, the city was searching in layers. Police searched officially, volunteers searched physically, reporters searched for updates. Neighbors searched their memories, the Hartley family searched for any reason to hope. Each layer moved at a different pace. A volunteer could finish a field and go home exhausted. A detective could finish an interview and begin another. A reporter could print the day's facts and wait for tomorrow. A parent could not step out of the waiting at all. This is the part case summaries rarely capture. For families, there is no shift change. There is no moment when the file can be closed for the night. The absence stays in the room. Evelyn's classmates and friends were also drawn into the investigation. They were young, and the event touched the edge of their own lives. They may have known her habits, her friendships, her ordinary routines. They could tell investigators whether she had seemed worried. They could say whether anyone had been bothering her. They could recall whether she had mentioned babysitting that night. They could help police understand her normal world. That, too, is part of patient detective work. Investigators do not only study the event, they study the life around it. They learn what is typical so they can see what is not. For Evelyn, the ordinary world included school, family, church, music, chores, and the small duties a trusted teenager might take on for neighbors. Those details may sound modest, but modest details help investigators separate rumor from routine. If someone claimed Evelyn had planned to leave town, police could compare that claim against her habits. If someone said she had been frightened of a particular person, they could ask friends and teachers whether that fit what they had seen. If someone suggested she had left willingly, detectives could place that idea beside the child left behind, the unanswered telephone, and the personal items separated from her. The known facts made a voluntary disappearance difficult to accept. Not impossible in the abstract, because investigators must begin with every possibility, but difficult in the specific. That is how a case narrows. Slowly, not by one grand answer, by one explanation after another, becoming less able to hold the weight of the facts. The officers also had to look at the calendar of the evening. It was a Saturday night, which mattered because people were out. There were social events, trips to theaters, dinners, errands, and visits. More people were moving through La Crosse than might have been moving on a quieter weeknight. That meant more possible witnesses. It also meant more ordinary traffic that could hide something unusual. A car that might have stood out on a Tuesday could blend into a Saturday. A person walking near Cass Street might be noticed, or might simply become part of the evening flow. Investigators had to ask what was normal for that block at that hour. They had to understand the neighborhood not as a map, but as a living place. The Rasmussens' home sat in a community where people recognized familiar faces. A stranger might be remembered, but memory depends on attention, and attention is not always awake before danger is known. A person could look out a window and see movement without keeping it. A neighbor could pass the house and think nothing of it. A car could slow near the curb, and no one would write it down in the mind. Only later would those moments be searched. Only later would people ask themselves whether they had missed something. That is one of the quiet pains of a neighborhood case. People do not only remember, they wonder why they did not remember more. As the first day passed, the search became more organized. Police began turning concern into assignments. Certain officers worked the immediate neighborhood. Others followed reported sightings. Others gathered statements from family members, classmates, and possible witnesses. A missing person inquiry can look wide from the outside, but inside the department, it must be sorted into lines of work. Who last saw Evelyn before she went to babysit? Who saw her arrive? Who knew the Rasmussens were away? Who had access to the house? Who was near Cass Street during the relevant hours? Who reported a vehicle? And where? Who reported a sound and at what time? Each question became a small file inside the larger file. The investigators also began checking people who might have had any connection to the Rasmussens' home. This did not mean accusation. It meant method. Delivery workers, repairmen, students, acquaintances, neighbors, and anyone else who might know the house or its routine had to be considered. Sometimes the most difficult part of detective work is asking ordinary people ordinary questions when nothing about the moment feels ordinary. Where were you that night? Did you drive past Cass Street? Did you know Evelyn Hartley? Did you know the Rasmussens were away? Did you notice a light on, a window open, a car parked nearby? The answers might clear a person from concern. They might add nothing at all. Or, rarely, they might introduce a small inconsistency that needed another visit. The police also had to examine whether any known offenders or troubling figures were in the area. That work, too, was careful and slow. A person's past could not become proof of involvement. An arrest record, a rumor, or an uneasy feeling could not carry the case by itself. Investigators needed evidence. They needed time, location, opportunity, and some link to Evelyn or to the house. Without those things, suspicion remained only suspicion. That restraint matters. A cold case can be damaged by certainty that arrives too early. The first week brought many names into the inquiry. Some were checked because they lived nearby. Some were checked because someone reported them. Some were checked because they had been seen driving, walking, or behaving in a way another person found odd. Police had to test each report against the clock. A man could seem suspicious to a caller, but have been working across town. A car could match a description, but have been in a garage all evening. A person could be unpleasant, evasive, or nervous, and still have no connection to Evelyn's disappearance. Detectives had to keep separating character from evidence. That is patient work. It is also emotionally difficult work, because the public often wants a name. The file wants proof. In those early days, law enforcement officers searched roads leading away from Crosse. They looked at routes toward rural areas, nearby towns, and the edges of the river country. They checked reports of clothing, objects, or disturbed ground. They responded when someone believed they had found a trace. Often the trace was not connected. A piece of cloth belonged to someone else. A mark in the dirt was older than it seemed. An object by the roadside had no relation to Evelyn. Each time the investigators had to go, look, decide, and record. False alarms were not interruptions to the investigation. They were part of it. Searches near water required particular care. La Crosse is shaped by rivers, and any search in that region had to respect that geography. Officers and volunteers checked areas along banks, bridges, and low ground. They did so because water is part of the landscape, not because it gave an answer. The rivers were places to rule in or rule out. The bluffs were places to consider. The wooded spaces beyond the blocks were places where a small clue could remain unseen. The searchers could not afford to prefer one landscape too quickly. They had to keep looking where the evidence allowed them to look. Meanwhile, inside the police work, the evidence from the Rasmussen home had to be handled and rehandled in thought. The broken or disturbed window remained one of the central facts. So did the personal items found near the property and along possible routes. So did the absence of an ordinary explanation. Detectives had to ask whether these details formed a sequence. If the window showed entry, what happened inside? If the window showed exit, why that route? If the items outside showed movement, in what direction? If the direction pointed toward a vehicle, where might it have waited? Each answer was conditional. Each answer depended on another. Cold cases often grow from these conditional sentences. If this was true, then that might follow. But if this was wrong, then the entire line had to be set aside. Investigators also had to think about sound. In a residential neighborhood, sound can travel unpredictably. A cry can be muffled by walls. A car door can seem closer than it is. A dog can bark at a passing animal, or at a stranger, or at nothing a witness can later explain. A neighbor inside a house may hear only a few seconds of noise and attach it to the wrong time. So officers asked again. They compared houses by distance. They asked who had windows open. They asked who had radios playing. They asked who was already asleep. They built a sound map as best they could, though no one called it that. The telephone became another quiet marker in the timeline. Richard Hartley's calls mattered because they created fixed points. A call placed and unanswered did not say what had happened, but it said what had not happened. Evelyn had not answered. That absence narrowed the possible time. The later drive to the Rasmussen home narrowed it again. In a case with few certainties, an unanswered phone can become a post in the ground. Investigators could measure other statements against it. Could a witness have seen Evelyn after that call? Could a reported car have been there before the call or after? Could a person's alibi cover the right minutes? The telephone did not solve the case. It helped hold the timeline still. The difficulty was that the timeline still had gaps. A few minutes can matter enormously. A person can cross a yard, enter a car, turn a corner, and vanish from view in less time than it takes a worried father to decide to drive over. That does not mean the event was planned. It means the physical world can change quickly. Investigators needed to know whether the disappearance took place in a short burst of time or over a longer interval. The condition of the house suggested interruption. The unanswered calls suggested she was already unable to respond. The objects outside suggested movement beyond the doorway, but the exact minutes remained hard to secure. The community response grew as newspapers continued to cover the disappearance. Evelyn's photograph appeared in print. Her age, height, clothing, and habits were shared. Search notices traveled beyond Crosse. People in nearby areas were asked to look for anything unusual. The story moved from neighborhood talk into regional attention. This helped, because a broader audience might remember a passing car or a roadside object. It complicated things, because attention brings many voices. Some voices carried useful facts. Some carried fear. Some carried only the echo of other people's stories. Police departments in other places were alerted. If a young girl matching Evelyn's description appeared, officers needed to know. If someone reported a suspicious vehicle traveling away from Crosse, that report had to be checked. If a person suddenly left town or behaved strangely after the night of the disappearance, someone might call. This was the practical net available in 1953. Telephone calls, telegrams in some situations, newspaper notices, radio bulletins. Human memory passed from one desk to another. No central digital system gathered everything at once. The net existed because people made it, call by call. As days passed, the first urgency began to meet the first exhaustion. Searchers could not remain in motion forever. Officers had other duties, though the case demanded attention. Volunteers had families and jobs. Newspapers needed new information. The Hartley family remained inside the same waiting. That change from emergency to sustained investigation is one of the most painful shifts in any missing person case. At first, every hour feels like it might bring a break. Then the hours become days. The days begin to gather. The case does not end, but it changes texture. It becomes a file that must be managed. It becomes a list of leads waiting for follow-up. It becomes a room where hope sits beside fatigue. The police kept interviewing. They spoke with people who had been near the Rasmussens' home. They spoke with those who knew Evelyn. They spoke with people who had heard rumors. They spoke with those whose names arrived by tip. Every interview carried the same need. Could this person add something verifiable? Could they place themselves accurately? Could they explain what they saw without borrowing from the newspaper? Could their account be checked by someone else? In an investigation like this, the question is not only what a person says, it is how the statement fits with the statements around it. Alibis became part of that sorting. An alibi is not a magic word. It has to be built. A person says they were at work, then detectives ask who saw them. A person says they were home, then detectives ask who can confirm it. A person says they were driving a certain road, then detectives ask when, why, and whether anyone noticed the car. Some alibis are strong because they are supported by time cards, witnesses, receipts, or many independent observations. Some are weak because they depend only on the person giving them. Some are incomplete, not because the person is guilty, but because ordinary evenings are hard to prove afterward. A Saturday night from weeks ago can be difficult to reconstruct. What time did dinner end? What program was on the radio? Who stopped by? When did someone leave? Which road did they take? Did anyone look at a clock? People live most nights without building proof of them. Only later does the past become evidence. That is why detectives ask repetitive questions. They are trying to help a normal evening become precise enough to be tested. In Evelyn's case, no confirmed suspect emerged from that early sorting. There were persons of interest, as there often are. There were people questioned. There were stories tested. There were names that appeared and then faded because the evidence did not hold them. It is important to say that carefully. A person can be questioned in a major case and never be charged. A name can appear in old reports without being an answer. The patient record must not turn uncertainty into accusation. What matters is the investigative pattern. Police looked, checked, compared, and moved on when a lead could not be supported. The reward offers and public appeals brought in additional tips. Some callers believed they had seen Evelyn in a car. Some believed they had noticed a stranger near the area. Some pointed to men they considered suspicious. Some repeated stories that had traveled through town. Each report entered a process. Write it down, assign it, check it, compare it, close it if it fails, keep it open if it has a thread. The work may sound plain, but plain work is often what keeps an investigation from drifting. The pressure on investigators increased because the case had become deeply known. A missing 15-year-old babysitter was not an abstract matter to people in Crosse. It touched parents. It touched teenagers. It touched teachers and neighbors. It changed how families thought about babysitting, walking home, answering phones, and staying alone in a house at night. That community concern was sincere. It also meant police had to work under constant questions. Have you found her? Do you know who did it? Is there danger? Should we be afraid? The answers were often incomplete. Incomplete answers are hard for a community to hear. Investigators had to protect certain details. If every fact was printed, then any later confession would be harder to judge. A person could claim knowledge they had learned from the paper. A caller could repeat a detail and seem credible, even if they had no true connection. So detectives often hold back parts of a scene. They keep certain facts inside the file. This can frustrate the public. But it gives investigators a way to test future claims. In the Hartley case, as in many older mysteries, it is not always clear today which details were held back and which became widely known. That uncertainty would matter later. As the first week stretched on, the search area continued to widen in thought, even when physical searches became less constant. Police considered whether Evelyn had been taken out of the city. They considered whether the person responsible had local knowledge. They considered whether the house had been chosen or whether the opportunity arose suddenly. Each possibility led to different work. A local person might have been seen before. An outsider might have left fewer social traces. A planned approach might involve prior knowledge of the babysitting arrangement. A chance approach might depend more on movement through the neighborhood. The evidence did not settle these possibilities. It left them open. That openness is one reason the case resisted resolution. When a case gives investigators a clear pathway, they can follow it hard. A named suspect, a reliable witness, a license plate, a distinctive object. A confession supported by hidden facts. A forensic match. The Hartley investigation had pieces, but not the one piece that gathered all the others. The pieces pointed outward. They did not converge. So the work continued in many directions at once. That can exhaust a case, not because people stop caring, because every direction requires time. The La Crosse police also had to consider reports from outside Wisconsin. Once a case reaches newspapers beyond its own city, sightings can arrive from many places. Someone in another state might believe they saw a young girl who resembled Evelyn. Someone might report a troubled conversation in a diner, a bus station, or a roadside stop. Someone might write a letter claiming knowledge. Each lead had to be treated with caution. Distance does not make a lead false, but distance makes verification harder. Detectives needed help from other jurisdictions. They needed local officers to check addresses, interview witnesses, and report back. The case became a chain of communication. Some leads likely took days or weeks to resolve. A tip would arrive, an officer would make contact elsewhere, a name would be checked, a witness would be located, the report would return. Then it would be compared to the known timeline. By the time one lead was closed, several more might have opened. This is how a file thickens. Not with answers, with efforts. Every page means someone went looking. Every closed lead means a possibility was tested and did not carry the case forward. The family had to live with that rhythm from the outside. They could not follow every lead themselves. They had to wait for news from people who were also waiting. A detective might say that a report was being checked. A day might pass, then another. The report might prove unrelated. The family would be back where they had been, but not exactly. Each disappointment leaves a mark. Each hope costs something. And still, families in such cases often keep hoping because love has no other assignment. The investigators, too, carried the case beyond office hours. Major cases do not stay neatly on a desk. An officer might go home and think of a witness he should re-interview, or he might wake before dawn with a small uncertainty about a time, a street, or the order in which 2 calls had been made. That is how unsolved cases begin to live in the people assigned to them. They become less like a task and more like a room one keeps returning to because something in it still seems unfinished. By the end of those first days, the Hartley investigation had taken on the structure of a major case. Local officers were no longer only responding to a missing girl. They were managing a growing system of searches, interviews, reports, objects, rumors, and public concern. Each part had to be held in relation to the others. A statement from a neighbor had to be compared with a statement from another house. A possible car sighting had to be placed beside the estimated time of Richard Hartley's calls. A discovered item had to be located, described, protected, and then understood without making it say too much. This is where patience becomes a method, not just a virtue. Patience means writing down the lead that sounds unlikely, because unlikely is not the same as impossible. Patience means checking the alibi of a person no one wants to suspect, because fairness matters. Patience means not announcing certainty when the file still contains only fragments. In La Crosse, that patience was tested almost immediately. The police had to decide how to divide the case. Some officers stayed close to the physical evidence. Some worked the neighborhood canvas. Some handled incoming telephone calls. Some searched wider ground. Some spoke with people in Evelyn's life, trying to understand whether anyone had shown unusual interest in her. The work became organized because it had to. Without order, a large investigation becomes a pile of sincere effort, and sincere effort alone is not enough. You can imagine a desk in the department with pages arriving faster than anyone can fully absorb them. A caller says they saw a car. Another caller says they heard a sound. A parent says their child remembers Evelyn mentioning the babysitting job. A resident asks whether police have checked a certain road. A volunteer asks where to search next. The telephone rings again. The file thickens. The answer does not come. In the early 1950s, every part of this work required hands. A name went into a notebook. A statement was typed or written. A report was placed with other reports. If an officer wanted to know whether a person had already been interviewed, he had to look. If an outside agency checked a lead, someone had to wait for the return call, the letter, or the report. There was no quick search through a database. There was memory, paper, and follow-through, that slow process mattered when possible persons of interest were questioned. Investigators had to look at people who had access to the neighborhood, people whose movements could not be easily confirmed, and people whose names came in through tips. But a person of interest is not a suspect in the public sense. It is often only a person who must be accounted for. Where were they? Who saw them? Did they know Evelyn? Did they know the Rasmussen family? Did they own or drive a car that matched a report? Could they explain their movements on the evening of the 24th of October? Some people could answer those questions easily. They had been at work, or with family, or at a public event where others remembered them. Some people could answer only partly. They had been alone, or driving, or walking, or moving between places without anyone paying attention. That was not proof of anything. It was simply the problem of ordinary life becoming evidence after the fact. Police also had to weigh the difference between a real inconsistency and a normal mistake. A person might say they reached home at 8 o'clock, then later remember it was closer to 8:30. A witness might describe a dark sedan, then admit under questioning that the streetlight was poor. A neighbor might first say they heard nothing, then later remember a noise after hearing others discuss it. None of these changes automatically meant deception. Memory is not a recording. It is something human, and therefore uneven. Still, each uneven place had to be checked. If a time changed, detectives asked why. If a vehicle description shifted, they asked what the witness actually saw. If a person had no alibi, they looked for one around the edges. Receipts, co-workers, family members, theater schedules, church events, gas station attendants, and neighbors could all become small anchors. The goal was not to trap someone with a technicality. The goal was to understand the evening as clearly as the evidence allowed. As the search continued, the reward money grew. Community members, businesses, and organizations contributed, hoping that a person with information might finally speak. The reward became a public sign of care. It also changed the type of information that came in. Some people called because they had remembered something. Some called because they wanted to help. Some may have called because money made a story feel useful. Investigators had to listen to all of them, without letting hope lower the standard of proof. A reward can open a door. It can also open many doors that lead nowhere. That is not a criticism of the people offering it. It is only the nature of a public case. Once a name and a reward travel through newspapers and radio, the case enters the imagination of strangers. Some strangers become helpful witnesses. Others become confused, frightened, or drawn to the attention. The police had to sort one from the other again and again. The press, too, became part of the structure of the investigation. Articles kept Evelyn's name before the public. They printed descriptions and updates. They told people where to call. They helped build search parties and maintain pressure. But newspapers also had their own rhythm. They needed facts, or the appearance of movement, at a pace the investigation could not always provide. When police had little to say, speculation could begin to fill the space. That created a delicate problem. If investigators said too much, they could damage their ability to test later claims. If they said too little, the public might feel shut out, and tips might slow. If they corrected every rumor, they might reveal what mattered. If they ignored every rumor, false stories might harden into community memory. There was no perfect answer. There was only careful judgment, day by day. The Hartley family stood at the center of that public attention. Their daughter's name was in newspapers. Her photograph was being seen by people who had never met her. Her ordinary teenage life had become a matter of regional concern. For a family, that kind of attention can be both comfort and burden. It means people care. It also means private pain has become public knowledge. Investigators had to work with the family gently, but also repeatedly. They needed details about Evelyn's schedule, friends, habits, and expectations. They needed to know who might have known she was babysitting. They needed to understand whether anything unusual had happened in the days before. They needed the facts that only family could provide, while trying not to ask the same painful questions too many times. But in a major case, questions return. They return because the file requires precision. Evelyn's life, as investigators reconstructed it, did not point toward voluntary disappearance. She was young. She was responsible enough to be trusted as a babysitter. She was expected. to check in with her father. She had left the child at the Rasmussen home unharmed but unattended, which did not fit a simple decision to walk away. Her belongings and the condition of the house pointed away from ordinary leaving. That combination shaped the investigation. Because of those facts, police focused on the likelihood that someone else had caused the disappearance. But that still left many possibilities. Someone may have approached the house because it was known the adults were away. Someone may have come upon the opportunity without planning. Someone may have been familiar with the home. Someone may have known Evelyn. Someone may have known only that a young babysitter was inside. The evidence did not point cleanly to one of these, so the file remained open in several directions at once. This is one of the reasons the case hardened without becoming clearer. The early facts were serious enough to demand a full investigation, but they did not create a single suspect path. They created branches. One branch followed vehicles. Another followed local persons of interest. Another followed possible sightings. Another followed the physical evidence near the home. Another followed tips from outside the city. Every branch had to be worked, because none could be safely ignored. As days became weeks, the urgent rescue effort began to change into a long-term, missing person investigation. That shift does not happen all at once. There is no single hour when everyone agrees the case has become something colder. Instead, the search parties become less frequent. The number of new tips rises and falls. The newspaper stories grow shorter. Officers return to old statements because new ones have slowed. The same facts are read again with tired eyes and steady hands. For detectives, the question becomes different. At first, the question is, where is she now? Then another question begins to sit beside it. What did we miss? That second question can stay for years. It can stay even when investigators did everything they could with what they had. It can stay because hindsight always has better light than the first night did. By then, some leads had already weakened under scrutiny. A sighting that seemed promising did not match Evelyn's clothing. A vehicle report could not be placed at the correct time. A person whose name had been given by a caller had an alibi that could be supported. An object found by the roadside turned out to have no connection. Each of these outcomes was useful in a narrow way. Each removed a false path, but each also left the central absence untouched. There is a quiet discipline in eliminating leads. It does not feel like progress to the public. It rarely creates a headline, but it protects the truth from being crowded by error. A false lead, if allowed to stay alive too long, can shape the way people remember a case. It can draw attention away from stronger facts. It can make a name seem important simply because it has been repeated. So investigators had to close what could be closed. That meant verifying stories from people who claimed to know something. Some claims came in as direct statements. Some came as rumors carried from one person to another. Some came as overheard remarks. Some came as letters. A person might say that someone had confessed in a bar. Another might say that a relative had behaved strangely after the disappearance. Another might say a friend had once mentioned Crosse in a way that sounded suspicious. Each report had to be handled without either belief or dismissal. A confession, especially, is not always what it seems. People confess falsely for many reasons. Some are confused, some want attention, some want to feel important, some are troubled and attach themselves to famous cases. Some may have heard enough public details to build a convincing story. Investigators know this, so they ask questions that only the responsible person could answer. They ask about details withheld from the press. They ask about times, places, objects, and movements. They ask whether the statement leads to evidence. Without that support, a confession remains only words. In Evelyn Hartley's case, later years brought claims and theories, but none resolved the file. Some reports seemed to open doors. Then the doors narrowed. A statement could not be confirmed. A timeline failed. A person was in the wrong place. A supposed memory changed too much when questioned. This is how a case can become full of information without becoming solved. It becomes crowded, but not clear. The difference matters. A clear case has lines that meet. A crowded case has lines that cross, vanish, reappear, and sometimes lead back to where they started. The Hartley file became crowded. It held evidence from the house. It held search reports. It held interviews. It held vehicle sightings It held possible confessions. It held names that meant something for a while and then less. It held the continued waiting of a family. Investigators also had to consider whether the public nature of the case had changed witness memory. When people read repeated descriptions, they sometimes begin to incorporate those descriptions into their own recollections. A person who saw a girl may later remember details printed in the paper. A person who saw a car may later describe it in terms used by others. A person who heard a sound may place it nearer the critical time because that time has become meaningful. This does not make witnesses dishonest. It makes them human. For that reason, the earliest statements often matter most. They were given before repetition could do as much work. They may still contain mistakes, but they are closer to the original memory. Later, investigators would look back at those first statements with particular care. What did the neighbor say before the rumor spread? What did the witness remember before the newspaper gave the detail a shape? What did the first officer write before the case became famous? The fame of the case was local at first, then regional, and over time, historical. In Crosse, Evelyn's name remained familiar. People who were children in 1953 grew older and still remembered the adults speaking in low voices. Families remembered being told not to walk alone. Former classmates remembered the shock of her absence. The case became part of the city's memory, not because anyone wanted it to, but because it had never been answered. That public memory preserved some things. It kept her name from disappearing. It kept the case available to later reporters and investigators. It encouraged people to come forward when they remembered something. But public memory can also blur. A detail from one article becomes attached to a different day. A rumor becomes a story told with confidence. A theory becomes, in some retellings, almost a fact. The cold case investigator has to move gently through that fog. Years after the disappearance, some people still believe they had information worth sharing. A person might call after decades because a relative had died. Someone might remember a car stored in a barn. Someone might recall an argument, a strange comment, a sudden trip, or a person who seemed frightened. These late memories cannot be dismissed simply because they are late, but they also cannot be accepted simply because they are moving. Time can preserve a detail. Time can also reshape it. When detectives receive an old memory, they have to ask patient questions. When did you first think this mattered? Who else did you tell? Did you write it down? Did the person named in the memory live in Crosse then? Could they drive? Did they have access to the area around Cass Street? Is there any record that places them there? Can this memory be connected to something outside itself? Sometimes the answer is no. The memory remains sincere, but unsupported. Other times it may point toward an old name already in the file. Then the detective turns pages. Was this person interviewed? What did they say? Who confirmed it? Were they ever re-interviewed? Did they own a vehicle? Did they move away after the disappearance? Did they have any known connection to the Rasmussen home? The old file becomes a map again. This is why record keeping matters so much in cold cases. A detective in a later decade cannot recreate the original investigation from memory alone. He needs the notes, he needs the dates, he needs the spelling of names, he needs addresses that may no longer exist in the same form. He needs witness statements made before time thinned them. If those records are incomplete, the later review begins with missing boards in the floor. In the Hartley case, as in many cases from the 1950s, preservation became one of the quiet challenges. Investigators at the time collected evidence according to the standards they knew. They could not know exactly what future science would need. They could not know that decades later, tiny biological traces might become important in ways unimaginable then. They could not package every item as if DNA testing would one day exist. They worked within their era. That is not an excuse. It is a condition. The physical evidence from 1953 carried the limits of its time. Some items may have been handled before anyone fully understood their later significance. Some may have been exposed to air, moisture, heat, or ordinary movement. Some may have been stored in ways that were acceptable then, but imperfect later. Some may have been consumed by testing, lost through transfers, or degraded by time. A cold case can survive in memory and still lose part of its physical voice. This is one of the hardest truths for later investigators. New tools do not automatically solve old cases. They can only test what still exists and what was preserved well enough to speak. A modern lab cannot examine an item that was never collected. It cannot restore a trace destroyed by storage. It cannot build a full picture from evidence that was contaminated before anyone knew how to prevent it. Science is powerful, but it is not magic. That is why later reviews of Evelyn's case had to be both hopeful and cautious. Hopeful, because time sometimes reveals what the first investigation could not. Cautious, because time also closes doors. A witness dies. A suspect dies. A building is torn down. A road is widened. A yard is changed. An object is lost. And sometimes, the person who once knew the answer decides to carry it into silence. That possibility sits quietly inside many cold case files, not as drama, but as a practical limit. A detective can follow evidence, but cannot force a memory to become a statement. A detective can ask, and ask again, but a witness may no longer be able to answer. So when later investigators returned to Evelyn Hartley's file, they were not only studying one October night, they were studying the long passage of time itself. The case had to be carried across changing desks, changing departments, and changing ideas about evidence. The officers who first stood inside the Rasmussen home were working in a world of paper reports, handwritten notes, and local knowledge. Later, officers inherited those pages after the voices behind them had grown older. Some original investigators retired, some witnesses moved away, some neighbors who had looked out from their porches were no longer living on those streets. The city itself kept going, as cities do. Families changed houses. Businesses opened and closed. Students came and left. The roads still led through La Crosse, but the night being studied moved farther back. That distance made every surviving record more important. A witness statement from 1953 was no longer just one report among many. It became a preserved piece of a vanished moment. The phrasing mattered. The order of sentences mattered. Even a crossed-out word could matter, because it might show what the witness first thought, before correction or pressure. Later, detectives had to read those early pages with a kind of double vision. They had to see what the first investigators saw. They also had to notice what those first investigators may not have known to ask. That is difficult work. It asks a person to be humble about the past, but not trapped by it. The original officers knew La Crosse as it was then. They knew its streets, its habits, its local faces, and its ordinary Saturday evening patterns. Later, investigators knew more about forensics, offender behavior, and the mistakes that can happen in major cases. Each generation had something the other did not. The first had nearness, the later had hindsight. Neither one was enough by itself. So the cold case review became a quiet conversation between eras. One page might describe where an item was found near the Rasmussen property. Another might list a neighbor's statement about a sound, a car, or a figure passing through the block. Another might contain a name that appeared once, then never returned. A later detective would have to decide whether that name had been checked fully or whether it had simply faded because stronger leads demanded attention. This is how old files are reopened in practice. Not with a dramatic moment, with a person sitting at a desk, reading carefully, and making a list. The list might begin with the physical evidence. What still exists? Where is it stored? Who last logged it? Was it moved from one room to another? Was it ever tested? Was it ever photographed clearly? Can the chain of custody still be reconstructed? Those questions sound dry, but they are the foundation. If an item cannot be located, it cannot be tested. If its history cannot be shown, a result may be harder to use. If it was handled by many people before modern precautions, any trace on it may be difficult to interpret. The evidence itself may still be present, but its meaning may be thinner than one hopes. Then the list moves to witnesses. Who was alive when the review began? Who could still speak clearly about the night? Who had given a statement but had never been re-interviewed? Who had changed their account and why? Who had heard something secondhand and who had seen something directly? A cold case investigator must separate memory from memory of memory. That sounds like a small distinction, but it matters. A person may say, "I remember a car near the house." But after many years, they may actually remember their mother talking about a car. or they may remember reading an article, then placing themselves near it in thought. This does not make the memory useless. It makes it something to handle gently. The detective asks where the memory began. Was it written down at the time? Was it told to police? Was it discussed in the family? Did anyone else hear the same thing before it became public? Those questions help determine whether a late memory still has weight. In Evelyn's case, the earliest statements remained especially valuable because they were closest to the night itself. But the earliest statements were also made in the confusion of a major search. That means they can be close and imperfect at the same time. A neighbor might have been honest, frightened, and imprecise. A searcher might have found an item, but not understood how important the exact location would become. A family member might have touched something before realizing the house needed to be preserved. These are human facts. They are not failures of care. They are part of the world as it was, moving too quickly around a sudden absence. Later detectives had to accept those limits without giving up on the file. They could not restage the first night. They could not ask every person to stand again where they stood. They could not return the streets to 1953, but they could read. They could compare. They could ask whether a detail ignored in one decade looked different in another. That is, one reason cold case work can feel almost archaeological. The investigator brushes away layers, a newspaper headline, a rumor, a later theory, a family story, a retired officer's memory. Under those layers, there may still be a small original fact, waiting. The work requires patience because the file does not always tell you which fact matters. It offers many facts. Some are firm, some are soft. Some were once believed important but became less useful. Some were barely noticed at first, but might connect to something later. So the detective moves slowly. A date is checked. A name is checked. A vehicle is checked. A route is checked. Then the detective returns to the beginning again. The Rasmussen house remained the fixed point of the case. Everything else had to be measured from there. The unanswered calls, the condition of the rooms, the child safe inside, the signs near the window, the personal items found outside, the search routes leading away into La Crosse. The house was not only a location, it was the last place where Evelyn's presence was certain. Because of that, any later theory had to answer simple questions. How did the person enter or approach? How did Evelyn leave that house? Was there a vehicle? Was there help from another person? Did anyone nearby see or hear enough to support the account? Did the theory explain the items found after she vanished? Many theories can sound possible in open air. Fewer can stand inside the room. That is why investigators return to the room even decades later through photographs and reports. They try to understand where a person could have stood. They try to understand what would have been visible from outside. They try to understand whether someone could have acted quickly and left without drawing notice. They study the space because space limits imagination. A house has doors, a window has height, a street has sight lines, a car has to park somewhere, a person leaving on foot has to cross ground. The physical world is a quiet witness, and it does not bend as easily as rumor does. Still, the physical world changes. A later investigator looking at Cass Street could not assume the view was the same. Trees grow, porches change, lighting changes. Traffic changes. A home's exterior may be remodeled. What a neighbor could see in 1953 may not be what a person can see now. So old photographs matter. Property records matter. Maps matter. Descriptions in early reports matter. They help rebuild the neighborhood as it was. Not perfectly, but enough to test an idea. Cold case reviews often begin with this kind of reconstruction. Before asking who, the investigator asks how. How could someone approach without notice? How could a person leave the house? How far could they travel before Richard Hartley arrived? How quickly could a car reach a main road? How soon would a neighbor have had to look out to see anything useful? These questions are plain, and they are hard. They force the theory to move through real minutes and real streets. In Evelyn Hartley's disappearance, the window of time was one of the enduring problems. It was narrow enough to suggest sudden action. It was wide enough to leave room for uncertainty. Richard Hartley's unanswered calls gave investigators important markers. But between a call and an arrival, a great deal can happen. That small gap became one of the most studied spaces in the case. If an event happened before the first unanswered call, then some reports might fall outside the useful period. If it happened between calls, then other reports might matter more. If someone remained nearby longer than expected, then the neighborhood canvas becomes more important. If a vehicle left quickly, then roads out of the area matter. Each version rearranges the file. That is why the timeline never stopped being central. A timeline is not only a list of times, it is the frame that keeps speculation from floating away. When later detectives reviewed the case, they would have needed to rebuild that frame as carefully as possible. They would look at when Evelyn arrived to babysit. They would look at when the Rasmussens left. They would look at when Richard expected her call. They would look at the times he tried the telephone. They would look at his drive to the house. They would look at when police were called. They would look at the first officer's observations. Then they would place witness statements beside those points. A car seen too early might not matter. A sound heard at the right time might matter greatly. A sighting made after the police arrived might reflect confusion instead of knowledge. Every statement has to fit somewhere, or be set aside. That work becomes more difficult when early reports are incomplete. If a witness did not look at a clock, the time may be an estimate. If a statement was summarized instead of quoted, tone and uncertainty may be lost. If an officer wrote only the conclusion, later investigators may not know the questions that led there. Cold cases are often shaped by what was not written down. A report might say, "Witness saw nothing unusual." But what did the witness consider unusual? Were they asked about cars? Were they asked about sounds? Were they asked about people walking? Were they outside at the relevant time, or only near a window? A short line can hide many unknowns. Later, investigators cannot always fill them in. They can only note them. And notes of uncertainty become part of the modern file. This is one of the more honest parts of cold casework. A good review does not pretend every gap can be closed. It names the gaps. It says, "This was not documented." It says, "This witness is deceased." It says, "This item is missing." It says, "This lead cannot now be resolved." There is a calm dignity in that honesty. It keeps the case from being forced into a shape it cannot support. Evelyn's file also carried the burden of many later claims. As years passed, the case attracted possible confessions, rumors, and names from outside the original circle. Some of those claims were likely sincere, some were probably confused. Some may have been attempts to attach a person to a well-known mystery. Each had to be tested against the old facts. A person claiming knowledge had to know something not already public. A person naming another person had to offer more than unease. A person suggesting a famous offender had to show a connection to Crosse, to Cass Street, or to the night of the 24th of October. Without that, a theory remains separate from the evidence. The case has sometimes been linked in public discussion to notorious Wisconsin offenders from later years. That kind of association can happen when a mystery remains unsolved and a frightening name enters the public record. But investigators cannot solve one case by the shadow of another. A known offender may be worth checking. Their movements can be reviewed. Their history can be compared. Their opportunities can be examined. But a name, even a notorious one, is not evidence by itself. In the Hartley case, no such public theory has produced a confirmed resolution. The file stayed open because none of those proposed answers gathered enough proof. That may feel unsatisfying. But it is better than a false ending. A false ending can comfort people for a while, but it does not serve the person who disappeared. It does not serve the family. It does not serve the record. So investigators returned again to the known ground. The known ground was not large enough to solve the case, but it was strong enough to reject many weak answers. That is an important distinction. A cold case file can protect truth even when it cannot reveal all of it. It can say, "Not this." It can say, "Not that way." It can say, "This person's statement does not fit the timeline." It can say, "This confession contains only public facts." It can say, "This rumor began years after the disappearance." Each rejection narrows the fog a little. But narrowing the fog is not the same as reaching the person at the center. For the Hartley family, those years of narrowing may have felt like walking in place. The police could say they had checked a lead. They could say a name had been cleared. They could say a reported sighting was unrelated. But they could not say where Evelyn was. That is the hard center of the case. All the work, all the pages, all the search parties, all the careful interviews, and still no confirmed answer. The family's waiting became part of the public history of Crosse. People remembered Richard Hartley's concern. They remembered that he had acted because his daughter did not call. They remembered the simple human beginning of the case. A father noticed a broken routine. That memory kept the case close to ordinary life. It reminded people that mysteries do not begin as mysteries. They begin as a phone that rings unanswered. They begin as a parent looking at the clock. They begin as a drive across town. In later years, when reporters revisited the case, they often returned to that same beginning. It gave readers a way back into the file. It also kept Evelyn from becoming only a symbol. She was not an abstract cold case. She was a 15-year-old girl trusted with a babysitting job, expected home, expected on the phone, expected in the next day of her life. The investigation, at its best, kept that truth in view. A cold case unit, or any detective reviewing an old disappearance, must be careful with the person at the center. The file can become technical. It can become a discussion of windows, timelines, alibis, and evidence storage. All of that matters, but the work only has meaning because a person is missing from it. Evelyn's name stayed in the file because people cared enough to keep asking. That care came from family first, then from investigators, then from neighbors, classmates, reporters, and later generations who were not alive in 1953, but still understood that an unanswered case is a public trust. Public trust is a quiet phrase, but it fits. When a case remains unsolved, the community inherits a kind of responsibility, not to solve it through rumor, not to invent certainty, but to remember accurately and to support the patient work of fact. Crosse carried Evelyn's case in that way. It appeared in anniversary articles. It came up in local conversations. It was revisited when cold case methods changed. It stayed available to people who believed, even after many years, that a detail might still matter. Sometimes those revisitations brought new attention to old evidence. Sometimes they brought nothing except renewed awareness. Even renewed awareness can matter, though it must be handled carefully. A person who once stayed silent might speak after reading a story. A family member might find old letters or photographs. A retired officer might recall where a box was moved. A witness might realize that something they dismissed long ago could be useful. These possibilities are small, but cold cases often live on small possibilities. At the same time, every public retelling risks adding another layer over the original facts. A dramatic retelling can make the case harder to see. A careless theory can turn an innocent person's name into folklore. A repeated error can become accepted because people hear it often. That is why calm retelling matters. Accuracy becomes a kind of kindness in a case like this. It asks us to slow down before we repeat a name, a rumor, or a theory as if it was settled. It asks us to remember that the file contains real people, not pieces arranged for a neat ending. And it asks us to notice how the very things that kept Evelyn's disappearance in public memory also made the investigation harder to keep pure. By the time later reviewers came back to the Hartley file, they were reading not only the original reports, but decades of retellings layered over them. Some details had been printed again and again. Some had been changed slightly by repetition. Some had been repeated so often that they began to feel firmer than the original record may have allowed. That is one of the quiet dangers of an old mystery. A fact can survive. A mistake can survive too. So a careful investigator has to ask, where did this detail first appear? Was it in a police report? Was it in a newspaper article? Was it in a memory given many years after the night itself? Those questions do not make the case smaller. They make it more honest. They help separate the original evidence from the story that grew around it. In Evelyn's case, that separation was especially important because the public interest never fully went away. The case had all the qualities that make a community keep looking back. A young person, a trusted errand, a safe child left behind. A father who noticed the missing call. A house that seemed to hold clues, but not enough of them. The facts were simple enough to remember and difficult enough to trouble people for years. That combination can keep a case alive. It can also create a space where speculation grows. A detective returning to the file had to walk through that space carefully. He could not ignore the public theories, because sometimes public theories contain old memories worth checking, but he could not let those theories guide the work unless they touched the evidence. That is the difference between curiosity and investigation. Curiosity can ask, what if? Investigation has to ask, what can be shown? The Hartley investigation needed what all cold cases need. It needed a bridge from a claim to a fact. A person says they remember a car. Can the car be placed near Cass Street? A person says they heard a name. Can that name be connected to Evelyn, the Rasmussens, or the neighborhood? A person says someone confessed. Did that person know something not printed in the newspapers? A person suggests a suspect. Was that suspect in Crosse on the evening of the 24th of October? Each question asks the theory to step onto solid ground. Many theories cannot do that. They remain in the air. And when a theory remains in the air, a careful investigator has to let it remain there, without forcing it down into the file as truth. This is one reason the case resisted closure. It was not empty. It had too much. Too many possible sightings, too many uncertain vehicle reports, too many later claims, too many memories shaped by fear, care, and time. But it lacked the one supported line that would pull those pieces together. A case can go cold in that way, not because nobody looked, not because there were no clues, but because the clues did not create a complete path. The first reason sits close to the beginning, in 1953 itself. The tools available to investigators were limited by the era. They could take photographs, they could dust for fingerprints, they could compare visible marks, they could collect clothing, glass, and other objects. They could search with dogs in some circumstances, depending on availability and conditions. They could interview and re-interview, but they did not have modern DNA testing. They did not have digital phone records. They did not have cell tower data. They did not have license plate readers. They did not have the National Crime Information Center, as later generations would understand it. They did not have instant communication between distant departments in the way investigators do now. They worked with notebooks, radios, telephones, paper maps, and local coordination. That does not mean the work was careless. It means the work depended much more heavily on what could be seen, remembered, and preserved. If the first officers could not identify a fingerprint, that print might remain silent. If an item held a trace too small to detect at the time, it might not be protected with future testing in mind. If a vehicle was seen only partly, there was no database to search by shape, route, or location. If someone left Crosse quickly, officers elsewhere had to be reached by ordinary means. The net existed, but it had large openings. Time could pass through those openings. So could a person. This was not unique to Evelyn's case. It was true of many missing person investigations in the middle of the 20th century. The difference is that, in this case, the early scenes seemed to promise evidence. The house, the window, the personal objects, the signs of interruption. Those things gave investigators something to work with, but they did not give investigators enough certainty. Fingerprints, if found, had to be matched through known samples, not searched across modern databases. A trace on clothing could not be interpreted the way it might be today. A hair, a fiber, or a small stain might be noticed, but not understood fully. The file had physical pieces, but the science of the time could only ask them certain questions. Later science could ask more, but later science could only work if the pieces survived. That is the second reason the case grew colder. Preservation is not the same as collection. An object can be collected and still lose value over time. It can be handled by several people. It can be stored in paper, cloth, plastic, or a box that later proves imperfect. It can be exposed to moisture. It can be moved from one property room to another. It can be lost when departments reorganize. It can be damaged without anyone intending harm. And in the 1950s, no one could prepare evidence for the full range of tests that would exist decades later. They could not know which hidden trace might matter. They could not know which surface would one day be sampled. They could not know how a future lab would evaluate contamination, so when later investigators looked back, they had to begin with a practical inventory. What evidence still exists? What condition is it in? Where has it been? Who handled it? Can it be tested without destroying it? Would a result be meaningful given the item's history? Those questions can be disappointing. they are also necessary. A cold case review is not helped by testing simply for the sake of testing. It needs testing that can answer something. If a trace is found on an item handled by many people in the first hours, the meaning of that trace may be unclear. If a sample is degraded, the result may be partial. If an item was stored with other items, cross-transfer may be difficult to rule out. This is why modern methods do not automatically unlock old rooms. Sometimes they open a door, sometimes they show only that the door has changed too much. Evelyn's case sits in that hard middle place. It began with physical evidence that seemed meaningful, but it aged through decades when preservation standards changed, records shifted, and the understanding of trace evidence expanded. Every year that passed made some things harder to know. A witness could still speak, perhaps. A report could still be read. A map could still be studied. But the original scene could not be protected forever. The house returned to being a house. The street returned to being a street. The leaves were cleared. The weather changed. The rooms were cleaned. The objects were moved. The night of the 24th of October could only remain through what had been captured before it disappeared. That brings us to the third reason the case went cold. The first hours were too crowded. This is a gentle thing to say, because the crowding came from care. Richard Hartley went to the house because he was worried. Neighbors came out because something was wrong. Police entered because a child was missing. Searchers joined because they wanted to help. Reporters arrived because the public needed information. But each arrival changed the environment. Each footstep near the home could affect the ground. Each person entering the house could alter what had been untouched. Each conversation among neighbors could influence later memory. No one needed to mean harm for the scene to become harder to read. That is one of the difficult truths of early investigations. People move toward a crisis. Evidence sometimes needs them to stand back. In a modern investigation, officers may secure a scene quickly with tape, logs, and controlled entry. Even then, the first minutes can be messy. In 1953, the habits and tools were different. The concern was immediate. The understanding of later forensic needs was limited. And the idea that a small unseen trace might one day solve a case was not part of ordinary practice. So the scene may have had more voices on it than a later investigator would wish. That does not erase the work done. It only explains one of the barriers. When a scene is not perfectly protected, later questions become harder to answer. Was this mark made during the event? Was this item moved by a searcher? Was this footprint original, or did it come from someone helping? Was this fingerprint left earlier in the day, during the search, or during the disappearance? Could a trace belong to a family member, officer, neighbor, or volunteer? Those are not minor questions. They decide whether evidence can point outward or only back into the confusion of response. In Evelyn's case, the presence of the unharmed child in the house also shaped that response. The first priority was safety. Someone had to check the child. Someone had to enter. Someone had to determine whether Evelyn was in the house, injured, hiding, or gone. Those actions were necessary. But necessity still changes a scene. This is why cold case work is full of trade-offs. What had to happen then may limit what can be known later. No one can go back and make different first choices with the wisdom of future science. They can only read the record with compassion and clarity. The fourth reason is the timeline. It was narrow, but not fixed enough. A narrow timeline can be powerful if it locks the facts together. It can rule out suspects. It can place a vehicle in or out of the right area. It can show whether a witness saw something before or after a key event. But a narrow timeline becomes difficult when its points are based on missed calls, estimates, and remembered sounds. Richard Hartley's calls were essential markers. They showed when Evelyn was not answering the phone. His drive to the Rasmussen home created another point. The arrival of police created another. But the exact moment when Evelyn became unable to answer was not known. It might have been before the first call. It might have been shortly before it. It might have been during a small interval that no one witnessed. That uncertainty left room for many possible sequences. A person could have approached the house earlier than some witnesses thought. A car could have left before anyone understood that it mattered. A neighbor's memory of a sound might fit one version, but not another. The more versions a timeline can hold, the harder it becomes to use, and yet investigators had to use it anyway. They had to place every lead against the clock. If someone said they saw a girl walking at a certain time, the detectives asked whether Evelyn could have been there. If someone reported a vehicle near the house, they asked whether it matched the known window. If someone's alibi covered part of the evening, they asked whether it covered the critical minutes. This work is precise, but only as precise as the information allows. If a witness said about 8 o'clock, the word about carried weight. If someone said shortly after dinner, detectives had to translate a household rhythm into an investigative time. If someone remembered hearing something before the radio program ended, they had to identify the program, the station, and the schedule. This is the patient arithmetic of an old case. It turns life into minutes. But life does not always give minutes cleanly. The fifth reason is witness uncertainty. Witnesses are often the heart of an investigation. They are also one of its most delicate parts. People remember with emotion. They remember from an angle. They remember after sleep, after conversation, after headlines, after fear. A witness may be sincere and still wrong about time. A witness may be accurate about one detail and mistaken about another. A witness may remember the color of a car, but not its direction. A witness may hear a sound, but attach it to the wrong moment. In Evelyn's case, the neighborhood offered many possible observations, but few that could be made firm enough. There were reports to follow. There were things people believed they had seen. There were accounts of vehicles and movements that had to be checked. But darkness changes certainty. Streetlights create shadows. Autumn evenings close in early. People inside homes hear through walls and windows. A passing car might be ordinary until later, when it becomes possible evidence. The mind then tries to retrieve it. Sometimes it succeeds. Sometimes it fills the blank. Detectives know this, so they ask details again. What side of the street? Which direction? How fast? Were the headlights on? Could you see the driver? What made you look? Did you tell anyone that night? Had you read the newspaper before remembering it? These questions are not meant to embarrass a witness. They are meant to find the solid part of the memory. In a case with no confirmed suspect, every witness account had to be weighed carefully. Too much trust could mislead. Too much doubt could lose a lead. The balance was hard. It became harder as time passed. A witness interviewed the next day might remember imperfectly. A witness interviewed 20 years later carried 20 years of life between the event and the statement. That does not mean the later witness had nothing to offer. Sometimes a memory held privately can stay surprisingly clear, but the later it comes, the more support it needs. A cold case detective has to ask whether the memory can be connected to something outside the person's mind. A record, a location, a date, a second witness, a vehicle registration, a work schedule, a family letter. Without that support, the memory may remain moving but unusable. The sixth reason is that no body was recovered and no final location was established. In missing person cases, the absence of a recovery can leave investigators without many answers that a later examination might provide. It can limit the understanding of route, it can limit the understanding of cause, it can limit the ability to connect a suspect to a place, it can leave the case suspended between known disappearance and unknown aftermath. For Evelyn's family, that absence was personal and painful. For investigators, it also meant the map had no final point. They had the Rasmussen home as the last certain location. They had items and reports that may have indicated movement. They had searches through streets, fields, roadsides, river areas, and outlying places. But they did not have the place where the movement ended. Without that endpoint, many theories remained possible. A local offender, a traveler, a person using a car, a person who knew the neighborhood, a person who acted suddenly, a person who had planned. Each possibility required a different geography. Each geography required searches, checks, and interviews. The absence of a final location meant the case could not narrow naturally. It kept widening. A case that keeps widening can lose force, not because investigators are lazy, because every mile creates more places, more people, more records, and more uncertainty. The seventh reason is the lack of a confirmed suspect pathway. Investigators could question many people. They could examine names offered by tips. They could check alibis. They could look at known offenders. They could return to people connected to the neighborhood. But none of those paths produced the confirmed combination needed: opportunity, presence, connection, evidence, a statement, a physical link, a reliable witness. Some cases are solved because one of those pieces appears clearly. A witness sees a person entering the house. A license plate is written down. A suspect is found with the victim's property. A confession includes hidden details and leads to evidence. A trace is matched in a way that can be explained. Evelyn's case did not receive that kind of convergence. It had suspicious possibilities, but not proof. It had leads, but not a line. It had names, but not a supported answer. That is where restraint becomes painful. A community may feel that someone must have done it, and that is true in the broadest sense. But investigation cannot stop at must have. It needs who, how, and how we know. Without that, a name remains a suspicion. And suspicion, even strong suspicion, is not enough to close a file honestly. This matters especially in an old case, because some people named in rumors may no longer be alive to answer. Their families may still live with the burden of those whispers. A careful retelling must avoid turning uncharged people into characters in a finished story. The police may have questioned them, the public may have wondered about them, but unless evidence carried the accusation, the record has to remain careful. That care protects everyone. It protects the wrongly suspected. It protects the integrity of the case. And it protects Evelyn, because her story should not be tied to an answer that cannot hold. The eighth reason is that the early complexity worked against certainty. There were many moving parts from the beginning. The Rasmussens were away. Evelyn was alone with a young child. Her father expected a call. The call did not come. The house showed signs that needed interpretation. Items were found beyond the immediate room. Searchers moved quickly. Neighbors tried to remember, and the press carried the story into homes before the facts had settled. That combination made the investigation active, public, and fragile all at once. It meant that useful information could arrive from any direction. But so could confusion. A person might report a car because they truly saw it. Another might report a car because everyone was now thinking about cars. A person might remember a sound with care. Another might place a sound into the wrong minute because the whole night had become meaningful after the fact. This was not a failure of the community. It was the cost of searching in public while the first facts were still taking shape. For investigators, the difficulty was not only finding leads, it was knowing which leads deserve to become the center of the case. A cold case often begins when the early center does not hold. The scene gives clues, but not enough. The witnesses give memories, but not certainty. The search gives effort, but not a final location. The public gives care, but also noise. And after a while, the case is no longer moving forward in a single line. It is circling. It is returning. It is asking the same questions again from slightly different angles. In the Evelyn Hartley case, that circling continued for years. Detectives returned to the Rasmussen home through reports and photographs. They returned to the window. They returned to the telephone calls. They returned to the items found outside. They returned to the people who had been near Cass Street that Saturday night. Each return had a purpose. Maybe a witness had remembered something new. Maybe a suspect in another case had a possible connection to Crosse. Maybe an old rumor could finally be checked against a record. Maybe an officer, retired or near retirement, remembered a detail not fully captured on paper. Sometimes that is how old cases move, not by a sudden breakthrough, but by one small piece becoming newly testable. But in Evelyn's file, the pieces continued to resist that kind of joining. The possible suspects did not gather enough evidence around them. The physical traces did not become a clear identification. The statements did not form a single confirmed route. The later claims did not carry the weight of proof. So the case remained open but unresolved. It stayed in that difficult place where people know something happened but cannot prove exactly who caused it. That is the final shape of many cold cases. Not silence. Not forgetting. A long, careful incompleteness. Over time, the investigation became part of Crosse history. Anniversary articles brought Evelyn's name back into the newspaper. Former residents remembered where they were when they heard. People who had been young in 1953 became older adults, still able to recall the feeling of that autumn. Parents remembered becoming more watchful. Teenagers remembered the sudden change in freedom. Neighbors remembered porch lights, police cars, and the strange quiet that follows a public search. Those memories mattered because they kept Evelyn human. They kept her from becoming only a case number or a story told for its mystery. She remained a daughter, a student, a babysitter, a young person expected to make a simple call home. That is where any honest retelling has to return. The case went cold for investigative reasons, but the loss was personal before it was procedural. The first consequence belonged to her family. They had to live with a question that did not stay politely inside office hours. It followed birthdays. It followed holidays. It followed quiet mornings and ordinary errands. It lived in the empty space where Evelyn's future should have continued. For Richard Hartley, the unanswered phone call must have remained one of the most painful facts. He noticed, he acted, he went to the house, and still, the window of time had already closed around something he could not stop. That is a hard truth, and it should be held gently. In missing person cases, families often replay the last ordinary decisions, even when those decisions were reasonable. A call, a wait, a drive, a door opened, a room entered, a name called into a house that did not answer. The investigation records those actions as timeline points. A family lives them as memory. The second consequence belonged to the investigators. The officers who worked the case had to carry the weight of effort without resolution. They had searched, they had interviewed, they had followed tips across Wisconsin and beyond. They had tested stories, checked alibis, and tried to separate true information from rumor. And still there was no confirmed answer. That kind of case can stay with an investigator for a lifetime, not because every officer believes every case can be solved easily, but because some cases feel close enough to touch and still remain just out of reach. Evelyn's case had that quality. There was a house, there was a known evening, there was a narrow time, there were physical traces, there were public appeals, there was a community watching. All of that created the feeling that an answer should have been near, but the answer did not come near enough to be proved. That gap between what feels possible and what can be shown is where cold cases often live. The third consequence belonged to later detectives and researchers. They inherited a file shaped by urgency, by paper, by old methods, and by decades of retelling. Their task was not only to solve, it was to understand what could still be known. They had to ask whether a clue had been overvalued. They had to ask whether another clue had been overlooked. They had to ask whether the evidence still existed in a useful form. They had to ask whether witness statements could still be trusted, challenged, or clarified. They had to ask whether a theory came from the record or from the public imagination. That is patient work. It is also modest work. A later review may not produce a headline. It may only refine the file. It may only say, this lead was checked more fully. It may only say, this theory does not fit. It may only say, this item can no longer be tested. But even those answers matter. They prevent the case from being crowded by false hope. They protect the difference between memory and evidence. They keep the door open only where the door is real. In the Hartley case, later attention has never fully disappeared. People still ask why the case went cold. The answer is not one thing. It is a series of small barriers, each one adding weight. Limited forensic tools in 1953, a scene that had to be entered quickly, physical evidence that may not have been preserved for future testing, a narrow timeline with uncertain minutes inside it, witness memories shaped by darkness, fear, and later publicity, a widening search area without a final point, tips and claims that required checking, but often led nowhere, no suspect pathway strong enough to hold in law, in evidence, and in conscience. Each barrier alone might have been overcome. Together, they made the case hard to finish. That is important. The case did not go cold because nobody cared. It went cold because care could not turn fragments into proof. Care could search. Care could remember. Care could offer rewards. Care could keep the file from vanishing. But care could not make a witness see more clearly than they had seen. It could not create a license plate where none had been recorded. It could not preserve a trace before anyone knew it would matter. It could not turn suspicion into evidence. That is the quiet boundary every investigation must respect. The truth may exist, But the proof must be reachable. And in Evelyn's case, proof kept receding. Sometimes it receded into time, sometimes into uncertainty, sometimes into the limits of old evidence, sometimes into the silence of someone who may have known more than they ever said. That possibility remains one of the most difficult parts of the case. Someone may have seen something and never understood its value. Someone may have understood but stayed silent. Someone may have carried a secret for years. Someone may have died with a small fact no one else could supply. Or the answer may have passed so quickly through Crosse that almost no one had the chance to notice. A car turning a corner, a figure moving through a yard, a sound heard, then dismissed, a detail lost before it was ever recognized as a detail. Cold cases are built from those lost chances. They are also sustained by the belief that not every chance is lost. A document may still exist, a photograph may still show something unnoticed. A family attic may still hold a letter, a diary, or a newspaper clipping with a handwritten note. A person may still have a memory they have never shared because they assumed it was too small. In cold casework, small does not mean useless. A small detail, if it is true and connected, can change the shape of a file. But it has to be handled carefully. It has to be placed beside the known facts. It has to survive the timeline. It has to do more than stir feeling. It has to help. That is why the hope around Evelyn's case must remain patient, not loud, not certain. Patient. The hope is not that a dramatic answer will suddenly appear fully formed. The hope is that one verifiable piece may still be found. A record, a location, a name connected by evidence, not rumor. A preserved trace that can still speak. A statement that contains knowledge not learned from old newspapers. A detail that returns the investigation to solid ground. Until then, the file remains what it has long been. A careful arrangement of known things and unanswered spaces. The known things are clear enough to tell softly. Evelyn Hartley went to babysit on Cass Street in Crosse on the evening of the 24th of October, 1953. She was expected to call her father. The call did not come. Her father went to the Rasmussen home. The child there was safe. Evelyn was gone. The house held signs that something had interrupted the evening. Personal items and traces widened the search beyond the rooms. Police, family members, neighbors, volunteers and reporters became part of the response. Leads came in, searches spread, names were checked, stories were tested, the case became known, then famous, then old. And still, no confirmed resolution came. Those are the boards of the case. They are plain. They are strong enough to stand on. But between them are gaps that have never been filled. Who approached the house? How did Evelyn leave it? Was a vehicle waiting? Did someone know she would be there? Was the person local or passing through? Did anyone see the crucial moment and fail to understand it? Did a useful clue vanish under the pressure of the first search? Did later evidence lose its voice before science could ask the right question? These questions have followed the case for decades. They are not dramatic questions now. They are old questions. They have softened at the edges, but they have not gone away. When we think about why the Evelyn Hartley case went cold, we are really thinking about the fragile nature of the first hours. We are thinking about how quickly an ordinary night can become a record. We are thinking about how much depends on a neighbor looking out at the right second. We are thinking about how much depends on a footprint not being stepped over, an item not being moved, a witness not being influenced by rumor. We are thinking about how investigators in one era leave a file for investigators in another. We are thinking about what time preserves and what time takes. There is no easy blame in that. There is only the record, and the record asks to be read with care. It asks us not to rush past the limits. It asks us not to invent an ending because the real one is missing. It asks us to let Evelyn remain at the center, not the theories around her. That may be the gentlest form of justice available when a case remains unsolved. To keep the person clear, to keep the facts honest, to keep the uncertainty from becoming careless. To say, this is what is known, this is what was tried, this is what has not yet been answered, and perhaps somewhere in Crosse, or in an old box, or in a memory not yet spoken, one patient detail still waits. The file is not loud now. It does not move with the urgency of that first October night. It rests in archives, in old articles, in police memory, and in the minds of people who still think of Evelyn Hartley as more than a mystery. It rests beside the image of a quiet house on Cass Street, a lamp left on, a telephone unanswered, a father arriving too late to find the simple explanation he wanted. The city moved on, because cities must. But moving on is not the same as forgetting. Crosse carried the question forward, not every day, not always in words, but in the way an unsolved case becomes part of a place, a shadow in local history, a name spoken carefully, a reminder that some files remain open because the truth has not yet found its way back. And so the story settles where it has settled for many years. Not with an answer, not with a final suspect, not with a solved line written across the folder. It settles with the known facts, the lost chances, and the long patience of those who kept looking. Evelyn Hartley's disappearance remains unresolved. The questions are still there. They can wait in the quiet for now. And somewhere, perhaps, the one detail that matters most is still waiting too.